All right. We're going to dig into Esther chapter 8 this morning. Y'all might have remembered in the first couple of chapters we talked about how this was a bit of an adult story. Yesterday, my daughter got a book with an Esther story in it for her 4th birthday, and they definitely cut some parts out. I read through it real quick last night, and it's interesting what they keep and leave out of there. Anyhow, let's begin with a little bit of review. We're getting to the end of the book. We've had a particular victory. We find Esther in the world of the dispersed Jewish nation. Some of the Jews have returned. They have started rebuilding the wall. The temple's probably been rebuilt. But yet we find that there are Jews living throughout the Persian Empire. And we get this little story of 2 Jews. What's their names? Mordecai and Esther, and they're cousins. But Mordecai raised Esther like a father. And what happened? What's the main plot line here with Mordecai?
The king finds out that he's suffering in jail, and then the king wanted to honor him because he saved his life. Saved the king's life, so Haman has to take him.
Haman is definitely persecuting him. He's building a gallows to hang him on, and we talked about how that was a skewer, basically. Not the same kind of gallows we might think of first off, but and he's made it 50 cubits high, so in the middle of his own courtyard. So he's trying to put Mordecai up on display, and at the same time, he's also made this decree to kill off this certain group of annoying people, right? And just so happens to be the same group of people that King Ahasuerus' queen is birthed by, right? So we have this culmination of lots of little events. The queen invites Haman and the king to a great feast. It's a part of her ploy to ask for help to save her people. And Haman's thinking quite a lot of himself. Mordecai is in much grief. He's dressed in sackcloth and ashes and pushing Esther to do these things, and continues to make Haman more and more mad, kind of pushes him over the edge. And Haman's ego gets the best of him, right? That's really what we see happen here. And while he thinks these feasts are all for him, he comes in the middle of the night trying to get Mordecai's head, be able to hang him. And the king asks him, what would you do for someone the king really values, right? And this was just the best part of it. There's a lot of good parts of the story, but to me, this is the best part. Haman says, put him on your horse, give him your clothes, show him that you have your personal stamp of honor on this person, and make a parade for him. Lo and behold, it's for Mordecai, not Haman, and Haman has to parade him around. And the next day, it goes right back to the feast where Esther says what? Someone has threatened my people and therefore threatened me, your queen. You stand to lose a lot, king. And he says, who's done this? And she says, the wicked Mordecai. Yes, the wicked Haman. Yeah. Certainly lots of prayer was going on to make all this come about. So we see God's actions kind of culminate in this event where Haman is now put on the gallows. There's a certain sense, and one of the major plot lines has concluded itself as we find ourselves at the end of chapter 7. But what remains undone? The law, yes. The king had signed this law by giving the signet ring, which will come up, to Haman. He had signed this law into place to kill all the Jews, effectively. Some interesting other background, the lots were cast for it to happen 10 months out, and we find ourselves in this chapter 2 months later when this law has happened. So there's still a long time before this mass execution is to take place, and Queen Esther needs to find a way around this law. Does anybody remember anything? Well, actually, we'll talk about that more in just a second. Let's go. Any other thoughts before we get started here? Yeah, Greg.
Where are we at? And I was going to say Haman kind of left us hanging.
Slick pun there. Haman left us hanging at the end of chapter 7. I'll have to remember that next time I go through this. I like it. All right, Esther chapter 8. Let's just read 1 and 2 here. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. I think I've mentioned this before, but on the Feast of Purim, when the Jews get together, they read the story, and the crowd goes every time Haman's name comes up. And I scared Patty. Yeah, well, Jewish Aggies. Maybe there's some cultish categories there. No. So this is some of the last time they get to do that, but the king takes this ring off, which ultimately allows the bearer to do what? Second in command, make laws as if the king has made the law himself. It's a signet of delegation of the power and authority of the emperor, the deity of the Persian Empire. And this isn't just written here. We see a lot about this type of power through what Herodotus wrote, a contemporary, wrote about this in the Persian culture. And so we see a lot of power being given now to Mordecai. The king already had reason to praise Mordecai for saving his life. I'm of the opinion that Mordecai held some kind of position early on, otherwise he would not have been allowed by the house of the king's virgins, right? I don't think anybody could just walk up and talk to the virgins in the window there like he got to do with Esther. But nonetheless, all of this culminates into where he really respects and trusts Mordecai, so much so that he gives him basically Haman's position as what? Second in command. I think that's inherent to what's going on here. And he gives what to Esther? Haman's house, right? And his estate. We kind of talked about this. This is probably more of a compound. There was multi-family unit, maybe, is one way to think about it. And it's interesting that he doesn't give this to Mordecai because Esther already lives in the palace, right? But it's more of a gesture of the power and wealth and things that might come across with that. I don't know, this may not be true, but I can't think of a richer Jewish woman in her own right in all of the Old Testament except Esther at this point. Kind of an interesting side note there. And Esther obviously is not going to insult the king by giving away her gift from him. So what does she do for Mordecai? She appoints him to the next best thing, basically the admin of all of this wealth and power that would come from the household of Haman. Can you imagine just days before, here's Haman getting ready to play the hangman with Mordecai, and all of his counsel and his family and his wife is sitting there getting ready to go after Mordecai, and here it is just days later, and now Mordecai is the ruler in place of and over everything that Haman had. complete reversal. And I don't know. You can imagine this gallows city, Mordecai coming home for the first night, and where he was supposed to be, the roles have just completely been flipped. Surely he took that down. But anyhow, okay. Any other thoughts about verses 1 and 2? Transition of power, maybe it's a great way to sum it up. All right, 3 through 8 here. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king, and she said, "If it please the king, and I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I have given Esther to the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." All right, so we see Esther's plea here at the beginning. Anybody notice anything that we've seen once before about her approach? The scepter's extended. What does that mean, Robert? She probably wasn't invited again. She's been given all of this great wealth and power, and it's come to Mordecai, and she probably has to put on her suspenders and pony up and go before him again uninvited. What do you think the king's thought was as he saw her come in? I think there's a point to that. Enough is enough. Like, I've given you the power, I've given you the money. You literally have the power of my pen. What else can I do for you? I can't change the law. And there's definitely some weight here to this, right? What does she ask twice? And maybe she doesn't ask, but she stipulates twice. If what? If I'm pleasing to you. And there's a sign of respect that's going on. Whatever seems right to you, O king. And there's an element here that she is giving deference to him. I'm not going to go make this decision on my own just because you gave me the ring. What might happen if they made a law that the king wouldn't support? They would be what? They might be hung, or they might, at the very least, the power could be stripped away, and they would have no influence. The king could put out the queen, clearly. We've seen that happen already. And so she's making sure that what she is doing pleases the king, and it's what he sees as a right. Any other thoughts about that? She makes it all about her people, right? She doesn't make it a lot about herself. Maybe that's an item of note, but
in previous text, her and Mordecai were communicating and having a plan, and by the absence of Mordecai in this conversation, I'm comfortable saying that she's still continuing on and making this plea, and she's stepped into a leadership role. But again, we don't, just because Mordecai's not mentioned doesn't mean that they haven't had conversation.
yeah.
I just see a stronger Esther.
One thing I didn't mention in verses 1 and 2 is I think there's some weight just to the fact that Mordecai came before the king. Either he was invited or this whole situation played out with the scepter. But I think you're right. Mordecai is definitely here encouraging the conversations to be happening. And there's going to have to be a great deal of strategy in how this plays out. And we'll talk about that more in a moment. But how does the king respond? I already mentioned. I gave you everything I could give you to go empower you. I can't change the law. What do you want me to do? What else can I do about this? Yeah, Brian.
Well, the first thing I find curious, the king doesn't connect the dots. He realizes now that Haman had devised a scheme to kill his queen and her people, and so he has Haman hung. And then life goes on, and it was incumbent upon Esther to remind him, my people are going to be killed, and by the way, he should understand that that would mean her as well. Mm-hmm. But anyway, she approaches him, and he says, okay, here, you got the ring, write a law to protect your people.
Yeah, that's right. However it happens, I think his response is just that. You have the tools you need. I can't do anything else for you. I think we'll talk about, let's just talk about it, the law here in the Medes and the Persians. This isn't the only place in the Old Testament that we've seen that, in fact. Does anybody know? We saw it back in Esther 3. We see it again, but there's another chapter in the Bible that references it. Does anybody know where that is? There's another chapter in the Bible that references the law of the Medes and the Persians. Obviously, it's in the later books. In Daniel chapter 6, verses 14 and 15, we read about this. What's going on in Daniel chapter 6? Daniel's been thrown in the lion's den. And did he have a good relationship with the king? And the king was unhappy. He had, again, been fooled, been tricked by his counselors, which maybe is a whole class lesson in its own right in these subjects. And we find the king here upset that Daniel was basically facing his utter demise, imminent and certain demise here. And the king, chapter 6, verse 14, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. The king wanted to deliver Daniel, right? And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. I mean, this is the king here. He can't just go say, yeah, we're not going to execute this guy. What is his labor here? He's trying to reverse engineer the law to find a loophole, maybe, to deliver Daniel. That's what he's doing till the sun went down. And then the men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, "Know, O king, that it is the law of Medes and Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed." So here we see another time that this law of the Medes and Persians that can't be changed is in direct conflict with our Jewish friends in captivity. Yeah, Robert.
I know that we're not saying that he's dismissive here, but in verse 8, you could also read it as it's kind of an epiphany and says, hey, there might be a better way. Let me actually, I've already given you everything I can directly, but you go right. What do you think is the right way to look at this, and then see where we go?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the context here. And that, when we see this situation in Daniel, it's not easy to write a law that can undo a law that can't be changed, right? You're really going to have to get creative. It's going to take some work, and the king doesn't do that kind of work. We've seen that throughout the whole chapter, right? He does things that are smooth and easy sailing, and basically he puts the onus, as Robert said, onto Mordecai and Esther. Yeah, Michael.
I think it's interesting to contrast, Mordecai and Esther with the king's signet ring versus Haman. Haman just, I don't know. He didn't really, I guess he did come to the king and ask, if he could make the decree. But I think, moreover, the point I was just trying to make is that she comes to him and is just being careful, is just a sign of good judgment. Would it be okay? How can we? They could have just written a law if they had his ring, right? I don't know if they. It seems like they gave Mordecai he gave Mordecai the ring in verse 2, so they could have just gone ahead and taken things into their own hands and not really shown regard for the king. But seems like probably a good move there again to talk to him first to try to flush things out and see what your options are before moving forward.
Yeah. I think anytime you contradict something that a very strong leader has put into place, you want to be very careful. And to your point, they showed wisdom and they showed transparency to that they were not acting as Haman might have. So those are excellent points there. The king finds himself handcuffed, I think, so to speak, which Jordan made the point last week or Wednesday night. This is the guy that sees himself as deity, but clearly there is a level of stability, at least in the political spectrum. If it's nothing else, it could be more than that, that keeps him in adherence to this law. And he basically says, you have what you need, go get creative, go do the work, and you'll figure it out if you can. Any other thoughts about this section before we move on? Yeah, Justin.
A little confused. So Haman's edict was signed and sealed with the king's ring and sent out, and it said destroy all the Jewish people. And now the king is saying to write another edict to not do that. Here's my ring, sign and seal it, send it out. What allows them to reverse Haman's edict, even though it was also signed and sealed?
I think we'll see here that we're not going to actually reverse it. And that's the trouble the king is having. Did you?
That's what I was
Yeah.
going to say. They didn't actually reverse it.
Yeah.
They found another way to get it done.
The edict still stood. They just made a counter edict that, and we'll get into that here in a few seconds. Yeah. Anything else? All right. So in the beginning of verse 9, we see them here in the third month. This is how we know 2 months have passed. Again, going back to that verse in Daniel, the king toiled all day trying to come up with something. It probably took lots of counselors, legal advisors, and a lot of time spent just getting the wording just so that it didn't undo the law, and it gave the Jews the power to defend themselves, which is what we'll see. Again, if you think if I'm Mordecai and I've got a bunch of distressed Jews in my kingdom that I'm now second in command of, does 2 months seem like a very fast-moving resolution? Does anybody remember how long it was going to be from the time Haman signed the first edict to the execution of it? It's 10 months, yeah. 10 months was how those lots were cast. So now we're 2 months later. Yeah, people anxious. I mean, the town's on edge. We saw confusion at the end of chapter 3, I think, maybe chapter 2. People are just confused, and this doesn't happen overnight. And I only point that out because you could read past this third month comment very quickly and not think much of it. But a lot's going on here, and I think probably, again, they're just perfecting and getting this just so worded just right so that it doesn't upset the king, and they can find a way to success and victory without complicating things more. So let's read 8, 9 through 12 here. The king's scribes were summoned at that time in the third month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day. And an edict was written, according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews, to the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed the Jews who are in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed forces of any people or province that might attack them. children and women included, and to plunder their goods on one day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. All right, so we talked a little bit about the timing. What do we see Mordecai, what trouble does he go to in writing this edict out? He just posts one note on the front gate of the palace and that's it?
Multi-language. Government, he's got it translated in several languages. He's got it to the civil authorities. He's got it to the community.
Every language, I would add to that, every language, every official, in every way he could communicate this, he made sure what? Clear and everybody knew. Yeah, Lee.
3, it says this, it's the same wording, every people, every language, except in Haman's version, he didn't tell the Jews.
Yeah, that's a clear, and interesting. I think we might have hit on this, but when Esther doesn't know what's going on, Mordecai has it transcribed plausibly because it wasn't written in Hebrew, so the Jews didn't know what was going on, adding to the confusion and thus the reason Esther couldn't read about it in the other scripts. But Mordecai makes sure everybody knows the Jews can do what? They can kill, they can destroy, they can annihilate. This is, this isn't legalese, but you certainly see what in this edict? Yeah, the absolute ability to defend. Preemptive, yeah. That's certainly there. Is there any wiggle room in interpretation of what this means? No, I mean it's fully fleshed out, right? We've got every way this can be interpreted is addressed, and there's lots of commas in this edict, kind of to point that out. Yeah, Robert.
Yeah, just 2 items here. The way that this differs from Haman's is the fact that this is to protect their lives and to defend against those that would attack them. So it's very much of the perspective of a fight for their lives as opposed to going out and destroying someone else.
Yeah. I think Mike makes the great add-on to that point, even though he made it first, is they can even look at groups that are forming, that might be forming to attack them and be somewhat preemptive in making that move. So that just, that kind of gives the rest of the groups of people a lot of things to think about if they're going to make a small militia to go after the Jews in their region. Like, even if it looks like you're building up a group to come take on and that just basically disincentivizes anyone to do that without a lot of intention and forethought.
Guns for hire.
Yeah.
That anybody forming it blanket covers. They're all on their own.
Yep. I think Miss Lucille said pretty early on when Haman wrote this edict, like, why don't they just defend themselves? Like, that's the reaction. And ultimately that's what we get to, right? Is they're given this ability to defend themselves. And we've talked a little bit about the great road system and ultimately the mail that could be delivered in Persia at the time. And we think of it as kind of probably pretty slow, but they actually were so sophisticated that something could get from Greece to the end of Asia in a week, which is pretty impressive. And we see how that's done here, written, that the Pony Express, if you will, the translation here says the delivery was on horses, riders of swift steeds, male offspring of royal mares. So these were the best horses and the best riders who were going to go out and take this job to the priority that it deserved. Yeah, Brian.
What I find interesting here is, of course, that the citizens of Persia were incentivized to kill the Jews because they could take all of their possessions and plunder and so forth, and it was their sole discretion, whereas the Jews were given the power only to defend themselves, not go out and attack people who were not provoking them. The second interesting thing is that the people seeking wealth, the Persians, still attacked.
Yeah.
Maybe because they hated the Jews, number one, but I think they're looking for the plunder, number two, and as we'll see, it cost them dearly.
Yeah, yeah. No, it is interesting. I think what I read in Mordecai's edict is, I'm going to disincentivize anybody from wanting to do this. I'm going to make it cost you. If you're going to try, you have a lot. You have to, it's a high stakes poker game at this point, right? They can't go plunder you unless you enact in this act of violence. Then they can take everything you got. They can kill your children. They can annihilate your household. And it's not so that the Jews have authority to do that. It's so they're disincentivizing that kind of behavior. Yeah, Justin.
I'm curious, and this may be an aside that we can gloss over or skip, but I'm curious about how they were armed. Like, does this edict give them the ability to be armed? As it says that, looking forward in chapter 9, that they destroy their enemies and knock them down with swords. And I would think when they originally went into captivity, they probably didn't come out with all their swords and armor, if they had them to begin with. I'm just curious about that.
Obviously they were able to defend themselves, which you'd have to have comparable weapons of the day to do. But I think we know enough about the Persian culture is that once they got people split up and assimilated, they tried to let them leave a non-captive life as much as possible. And what freedoms they had or didn't have, I'm certainly not an expert in, but maybe there's something to that. Is once you're not in a community of 50,000 Jews anyway, you're not going to mount up a militia, and if you have a sword, so be it. I don't know. That could be something that they had to go acquire, but this edict definitely would have allowed them to go acquire it, I think, if they didn't already have it. Coming back to these horses, I just think it's an interesting. This is why I think this took so much work, because we talked about it waiting 2 months, and now once it's done, Mordecai uses the most express way he can to deliver this message, maybe just adding color to what it took to get this edict written. Any other thoughts around any of this? Albert?
Try to read in Granny's question earlier in the week, it hadn't dawned on me, but they would have been an enemy of the state if they had fought back. They had the kingdom had made them an enemy, so if they had fought back, they would be annihilated because they were an enemy of the kingdom. And so, yes, they could have fought back, but organizing would have still sealed their fate. But now, like, we see what the plan has been, and it's just, that's it. That's the thought I had to say.
That makes sense. They certainly didn't have the backing of the empire or the emperor to defend themselves before this edict was written. All right, good thoughts there. Now, I would just point out we have 8 months left before this day, right? Whatever the state of weaponry is, I don't know, whatever the state of the foreign militias, they can go train, they can get their plans in order, they have time to put all this together. And I would imagine this would bring a great deal of peace to the confused state that we saw back at the end of chapter 3, right? That this kind of brings balance, and that the king is not, and maybe even just the good riddance of Haman could have brought some peace and calmed some anxiety that existed in the nation. All right, let's read 13 and 14. A copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all peoples. And the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. Didn't we just read this? What's the point of these two verses being in here, somewhat repetitive of 9 through 12? It happened just as Mordecai, the Jew, who was about to be hanged, said throughout all of the empire, right? So this wasn't just some fantasy, this wish of Mordecai. He now has the authority, and exactly as he said for it to happen, it happened. And I don't know. I don't know what else that would mean to make that repetitive here, but I think Mordecai clearly has the power now. The Jews have the right to defend themselves. Verse 15, then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in the royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple, and the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. We'll continue on just a second, but remember what Haman wanted for himself? To wear the king's robes and to be on the king's horses and to have a crown. And Mordecai already got that for the parade, but now here he is as maybe more of a permanent position. And what a great come about that we see in this story from this perspective. Verse 16, the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor, and in every province, in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jew, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. So what do we see happen here? Some of that peace I talked about a few minutes ago is seeping its way through the countryside. The Jews are happy. They make this new feast, which we'll talk about more. Is that the second bell? First. So they make this feast, and they're very relaxed. And what do we see happen? How much you? Maybe we could call this proselytization. I'm not sure. They certainly see what's happening in the kingdom for the Jews. They see who's winning. Haman's not. Haman's not winning. Mordecai is in power. He's got the king's signet ring. And basically, they have all been given permission to defend themselves. Who wants to go up against those three things? It's a very efficient time to become a Jew, so to speak. And maybe it was just people wanted to stand arm in arm against a mistreated culture in the kingdom. But nonetheless, we see this fear come over the people. Now, I do think it's interesting. I'm not going to say there was no proselytization, because we do see in Ezra when they return, in fact, one of the big problems is nobody knows who is a Jew. In fact, they have to go and stop before they can really make farms and things and hash out, do you have a genealogy in the first 2 chapters of the book of Ezra? Because there are these people that have joined the Jewish nation. And I think out of 50,000, about 2%, if I remember right, came back were not actually Jews. And so certainly there are people here that come to the Lord through this. They see the power. I would suggest to you maybe, though, that as much as people read signs and divinations from the deities of the day, that this was maybe more of an effort to say the tide has turned towards the Jews and the gods are clearly favoring them, and I want to be on that side. I mean, I can only place myself in that culture so much, but I think that may be true. This joy, this lightheartedness is the same word in Hebrew for a horse neighing. And I don't know how to interpret that exactly, but you could see the relief and maybe a peaceful pasture and a horse running through. I don't know if that's intentional, but nonetheless, there it is. And you could kind of caveat this whole chapter as the rise of Mordecai, right? We see Mordecai come to power and take his place in the nation and with God's help and Esther's commitment, save the Jewish nation. And any other notes there? Guess one other note on proselytization is most Jews today are not of the Jewish bloodline. In fact, we see in around 400 AD, most of the Jews in Eastern Europe have no affiliation. They're Russians, right? And I don't know if there's something to be gleaned from this story to that event, but there's a big concept in the Jewish nation called the 13th tribe, where because everyone has no idea who they are or where they've come from, and maybe this is a spot where some of that kicked off, and there was a big Jewish presence in that part of the world for the next several hundred years. Any other thoughts or observations? Yeah, Albert.
That the answer to my question is God's will would have been done, but just imagine the challenge is when the king couldn't sleep and they opened the book and it went to the decree of killing the Jews, and the king going, "Why haven't we done this yet?" And then Haman being there. So it's all supposition of how much more challenging. And the answer again is God. If Moses hadn't accepted his role, God would have found somebody else. So it's just think again, thinking of all the opportunities that we see God's providence throughout this entire book.
Yep. Reminded me of something I was thinking. The king could have said, "I love my queen. The law, I don't care about it." In this case, how many times do we want God to do that for us? Just write off everything and favor me, right? And I'm not trying to make a hazardous God by any means, but certainly there's a lesson here in how God works, and maybe we'll look at we'll have a whole lesson on providence next Sunday after we finish the book, and we'll talk about some of those things then. So there's the second bell. Any other thoughts before we go? All right, we'll see y'all Wednesday night. Thank you.